A 31-year-old woman vanished along the Colorado Trail. She set out alone, carrying her backpack, food supplies, and a small camera, hoping to find peace and solitude in the mountains. But after days passed with no word, her friends and family grew anxious. They called the authorities. Search teams flooded the wilderness, scouring ravines, trees, and riverbeds. Yet all they found was silence. 2 years went by, and the question still hung in the air. How could an experienced outdoors woman, familiar with the trails and survival, disappear without leaving a trace? No footprints, no clothing, no body. It was as if she had dissolved into the mountain wind. Then, one day, the first clues surfaced, small, almost insignificant, yet impossible to ignore. A worn-out hiking shoe, wedged deep in a rocky crevice. Inside, hidden carefully, was a tiny memory card, weathered, scratched, but intact. And when that card was opened, the mystery began to unravel. She was 31 years old, a woman who seemed to belong more to the open sky than to any crowded street. Friends described her as independent, soft-spoken, but with a quiet determination that pushed her toward long roads and difficult trails. She grew up in a small Midwestern town where the horizon stretched wide and unbroken. Even as a child, she loved to wander outside alone, disappearing into fields or forests until the sun dipped low and the crickets began to sing. Over the years, hiking became more than just a pastime. It was a form of escape, a way to shed the noise of everyday life and return to something simpler. She was not reckless. Those who knew her said she studied maps, checked weather reports, and carried the right gear. But there was also a part of her that needed solitude, a need that only the wilderness could satisfy. That need was what eventually brought her to Colorado and to one of the most challenging journeys of her life. The Colorado Trail. Stretching nearly 500 miles from Denver to Durango, the trail cuts through dense forests, alpine ridges, and remote valleys where few people ever pass. It is a landscape of extremes: burning sun in the day, freezing winds at night. Summer storms roll in without warning, turning paths into rivers of mud and stone. Yet, for those who choose it, the Colorado Trail offers a rare kind of beauty, the kind that only reveals itself to those willing to suffer for it. For her, the trail was not just a test of endurance, it was a pilgrimage. She wrote in an email to a friend that summer that she wanted to reset, to step away from the weight of modern life, and listen only to her footsteps, to the wind, to the sound of her own breath. She carried a camera to capture moments along the way: wildflowers at dawn, ridges touched by fading light, the solitude of an empty path stretching endlessly ahead. Local hikers who saw her in the days before she vanished remember her as polite, reserved, but with eyes that carried a spark of determination. She resupplied in a small mountain town, buying dried food, a bit of fuel for her stove, and speaking briefly with a store clerk about the miles ahead. Nothing seemed unusual. She packed her bag, adjusted her worn boots, and walked back toward the trail. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. What lay ahead for her was a wilderness that could be breathtaking one moment and merciless the next. And somewhere along that stretch of mountains, between thunderclouds and silence, her story would take the darkest turn. In the days leading up to her disappearance, there were small glimpses into her journey, tiny fragments of a trail story that now feel heavier in hindsight. She had been on the Colorado Trail for nearly 3 weeks, moving steadily through the shifting landscapes, covering 20 miles some days, fewer on others when storms or fatigue slowed her pace. Her journal, later found in her apartment, revealed her thoughts with a kind of simplicity: notes about the weather, sketches of mountain ridges, the satisfaction of cooking warm oatmeal in the cold mornings. But in between those simple entries, there were lines that hinted at something else: loneliness creeping in, the exhaustion of carrying herself through so many miles, and a strange feeling of being watched in the woods. On her final stop in a small trail town, she visited the post office to pick up a resupply package she had mailed to herself weeks earlier. A few hikers remembered seeing her there. She was polite but quiet, keeping to herself, focused on sorting food into her pack. She stopped briefly at a cafe, sipping coffee, glancing out the window at the sky, which was already beginning to darken with signs of a storm. One local who exchanged a few words with her said she seemed distracted, as if her mind was already back on the trail. That afternoon, she shouldered her pack once more and headed out. The trail ahead led into the San Juan Mountains, one of the most rugged and remote stretches of the entire Colorado Trail. For many hikers, this section was the most intimidating. Long climbs above tree line, unpredictable weather, and long distances between places of safety. Yet she walked into it alone, her boots sinking into soft earth as thunder echoed in the distance. The last confirmed sighting of her came from another thru-hiker, a man heading the opposite direction. He described passing her on a narrow section of trail. She gave him a brief nod, but there wasn't much conversation. He remembered that her clothes were damp, likely from the rain earlier that day, and that she looked tired but determined. To him, it was just another moment between strangers in the wilderness. To investigators later, it became the final living trace of her. That night, weather reports show a storm front moved into the region, heavy rain, lightning, and sudden drops in temperature. Searchers would later say that conditions like those could quickly overwhelm even an experienced hiker. Hypothermia could set in within hours. Yet, oddly, no one found signs of camp where she should have stopped. No tent, no stove, no fire pit. It was as if she kept moving, even as the storm closed around her. 2 days later, when she failed to appear at her next scheduled checkpoint, a place where she was supposed to send a brief message to her family concern began to grow. At first, her parents thought she might simply be delayed by weather, but as days turned into a week, the silence became unbearable. They contacted the sheriff's office, and the official search began. But before the search teams combed the mountains, before helicopters circled above the ridges, and before volunteers traced every path looking for footprints, she had already walked her final miles alone. Somewhere along the trail, in those last 2 days, she made choices we may never fully understand, whether to push forward despite the storm, whether to hide when she felt unease, whether to leave a message behind and hope someone would someday find it. Those choices led her deeper into the wilderness, where the trail turned narrow and the trees pressed close, their branches dripping from the rain. The wind howled through the valleys. And as darkness fell, she was last seen walking into a storm that would swallow her completely. When she did not check in at the next waypoint, her family's concern quickly hardened into fear. She had always been reliable about sending updates, brief messages or phone calls whenever she passed through a town. Silence was unlike her. On the 7th day without word, they called the local sheriff's office. Within hours, the case escalated into a full-scale search and rescue mission. The first teams moved quickly into the San Juan Mountains, starting from the section of trail where she had last been spotted. Volunteers, park rangers, and professional SAR crews combed the wilderness. Helicopters traced slow circles above the ridgelines, their blades echoing off the granite walls. From the air, searchers scanned for any trace of a bright tent, a campfire, or a lone figure waving up from the valleys below. On the ground, others walked carefully, shouting her name into the trees, their voices swallowed by the storm-damp air. For the first few days, hope was still strong. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to clothing she had left at home, trying to catch her scent along the trail. One handler said the dogs reacted near a section of muddy ground where the rain had carved gullies across the path. But the rain had already washed away most tracks, blurring what could have been her footprints into nothing more than soft impressions. Then came small fragments, clues that seemed to promise answers but only deepened the mystery. A broken trekking pole was found leaning against a fallen log. A scrap of laminated map, soaked and torn, lay half buried in the mud. One searcher thought it might have been hers, but there was no way to prove it. Each discovery was cataloged, photographed, then carried out of the woods, but none provided the connection they needed, a sign of life. The days stretched on. More volunteers arrived, some driving hours to join the effort. Entire ridgelines were swept, valleys searched, streams checked for traces of gear washed downstream. Still, there was nothing, no camp, no backpack, no body. As one search leader later said, it was as if she had been lifted out of the forest by invisible hands. After 2 weeks, the official search began to scale back. Helicopters were grounded. Many volunteers returned home. Families of missing hikers often describe this moment as unbearable, the sudden shift from action to silence, from hope to a void of unanswered questions. Her parents and close friends refused to give up, even as the case was marked cold. They returned on anniversaries, retraced sections of trail themselves, left flyers at trailheads, and prayed for a hiker to stumble upon something new. But in those first weeks, despite the manpower, despite the technology, despite the countless hours poured into the wilderness, nothing tangible was found. She had vanished in a way that defied logic. And for years, the only record of her disappearance would be the thin reports filed away in a sheriff's office, describing in dry language what really was the beginning of a haunting mystery. Years slipped by, and the trail went on without her. Seasons changed, snow burying the ridges in winter, wildflowers blooming each summer where search teams once walked. Hikers came and went, some finishing the Colorado Trail, others turning back, their journeys blending into the rhythm of the mountains. Yet for her family, time did not move so smoothly. Each passing year was marked not by birthdays or holidays, but by the absence of her voice, her laughter, the life that should have continued but never did. Her parents organized memorial hikes, inviting friends, strangers, and other thru-hikers to walk sections of the trail in her name. They spoke of her love for the mountains, of her independence, of the determination that had defined her. Photos were pinned to trailhead boards, her smile frozen in time. People stopped to read them, some whispering a silent prayer, others shaking their heads at the cruel reminder that even experienced hikers can vanish without a trace. The story of her disappearance began to take on a life of its own. In trail towns, hikers shared it around campfires, their voices low, as if telling a ghost story. Some believed she had been caught in a storm, her body hidden in a ravine or under a rockslide. Others whispered darker theories that she had encountered someone in the backcountry, someone with intentions far more dangerous than the weather. A few insisted she had chosen to disappear, to walk away from the world forever. Online forums, filled with speculation, theories stacking on top of theories, but never with answers. Her family read some of them, though they tried not to. What they wanted wasn't debate, it was truth. And through it all, the mountains kept their silence. No gear surfaced, no bones, no clothing. The trail gave nothing back. It was as if she had been swallowed whole, leaving only questions that grew sharper with each passing year. Until, almost 6 years later, when a single clue so unlikely, so fragile, emerged from the wilderness, and for the first time, the silence of the mountains began to crack. It happened in late summer, almost 6 years after she vanished. A group of hikers, traveling off the main trail in search of a secluded campsite, stumbled upon something unusual in a narrow, rocky gulch. The air there was still, the kind of silence that feels heavier than it should. One of them noticed a shape wedged between stones, partly hidden by dirt and moss. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than debris, another piece of gear left behind by time and weather. But when they pulled it free, they realized it was a hiking shoe. The shoe was battered, its fabric torn, its color faded to a dull gray. The sole was peeling, the laces stiff with age. But there was something strange, something deliberate about the way it had been placed. It hadn't simply washed there in a storm or rolled down from the trail. It looked as if it had been hidden. Curiosity turned to unease as one of the hikers turned the shoe upside down. Inside, stuffed deep in the heel, was a small object wrapped in layers of plastic. They peeled the wrapping away and revealed a micro SD card, scratched and weathered but unmistakably intact. The group fell silent, staring at the tiny piece of technology that had no business being there, buried in the wilderness inside a shoe. When they carried it back to town and handed it over to authorities, the discovery made immediate headlines. News outlets called it a breakthrough in a case that many had assumed was unsolvable. A missing hiker, gone for years, and now a sliver of evidence, something she herself may have hidden with her last strength. Why would she place it in her shoe? Investigators speculated she must have known her situation was dire. A shoe was waterproof enough, protective enough, and private enough to conceal something important. It suggested intent, a desperate attempt to ensure that, even if her body was never found, her story might be. For her family, the phone call that followed was a shock, equal parts hope and dread. After years of silence, here was something, an object she had touched, perhaps in her final hours. And within it, the possibility of answers. The SD card was sent to specialists for recovery. It would take weeks before anything could be confirmed. But the mere fact of its existence changed everything. For the first time in years, the trail was no longer silent. The mountains had given up a secret. When the SD card was recovered and the data restored, the first images and clips appeared harmless, even ordinary. There were shots of the young woman setting up her tent on a windswept ridge, her tired yet radiant smile directed at the camera, and a simple dinner of instant noodles with half a bottle of water resting beside her. In the fading light of dusk, everything seemed to capture the day. But as the files continued to play, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. The camera began to shake, at times tilting sharply, as if the person holding it was either in a rush or too weak to keep it steady. In one short clip, no more than a few dozen seconds, the sound of wind whistling through the rocks resembled eerie whispers. Darkness pressed in on every side, and the woman's trembling voice could be heard murmuring broken phrases. "I can hear." The recordings that followed were even more unsettling. At times, she breathed heavily, her voice quivering as she described the feeling of being watched in the pitch-black forest of towering pines. Another video captured only the ground, where overlapping footprints mixed with strange drag marks, as though something heavy had been pulled through the damp earth. Anyone who watched could sense the fear creeping into every breath she took. The final file on the SD card was brief, but it lingered in the mind far longer than any of the others. The camera had been placed on the ground at an angle, capturing only part of her face under the dim, flickering light of a flashlight. Her eyes were sunken with exhaustion, yet they remained wide open, filled with a raw, unrelenting vigilance. In those last seconds, she turned her head sharply toward the darkness and whispered, "There's so." And then, there were no further clues, no closure, just fragments of memory scattered across the SD card, painting the outline of a journey that had ended in fear. To those who viewed the footage, each frame felt less like documentation and more like a final message, a haunting testament, both painful and unresolved, hinting at a truth that has never been fully uncovered. When the contents of the SD card became public, theories quickly emerged. Some were grounded in logic and science, while others ventured deep into the realm of the strange and unexplainable. The first and most straightforward theory suggested that what happened was the result of disorientation and exhaustion. Long-distance hikers often face sudden storms, floods, and treacherous landscapes that wear them down physically and mentally. Fatigue, dehydration, and lack of sleep can create conditions where hallucinations take hold. A whisper in the wind, a strange echo in the rocks, or even the flickering of light can all feel sinister when the body is near its limit. According to this view, the entries on the SD card fragmented notes of fear and confusion were nothing more than desperate attempts to make sense of exhaustion-induced illusions. But not everyone agreed. Seasoned hikers who reviewed the notes pointed out something unsettling. The writing showed a level of structure that didn't resemble the typical disorganized ramblings of a sleep-deprived mind. The repeated descriptions of shadows, footsteps, and the sense of being followed hinted at something more deliberate. Some argued that such consistency suggested that the hikers were not merely hallucinating, they were recording something real. Another theory suggested human intervention. The Rocky Mountains are vast, rugged, and unforgiving. Hidden communities, hermits, or even those engaged in illegal activities could have crossed paths with the hikers. What if the whispers in the dark were not imagined at all, but voices intentionally concealed? If so, the sense of being watched was not paranoia, but reality. This possibility struck fear into many who read the files, for the words echoed like a warning. Something is out here with us. Then came the darker interpretation, criminal intent. Some investigators wondered whether the hikers had stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see, an operation, a hidden path, or a group protecting its secrecy. In this scenario, the SD card becomes more than a diary, it is evidence. The meticulous notes, the timestamps, the mounting dread, everything could be read as the trail of someone documenting their final days, unknowingly recording clues to their own disappearance. Skeptics, however, reminded everyone that no theory had hard proof. Some connected the case to the infamous Missing 411 phenomenon, where people vanish under bizarre circumstances in remote wilderness areas across North America. Victims are often experienced outdoorsmen. Their remains found years later in places previously searched, their belongings arranged in inexplicable ways. The similarities were undeniable: unexplained absence, fragments of personal items, and cryptic records left behind. For many, the SD card fit neatly into this haunting pattern. Still, others warned that the truth might be something far less supernatural, yet no less tragic. Perhaps the hikers were simply lost, panic set in, and their notes reflected the torment of people caught between survival instincts and despair. The entries, then, would not be coded messages of a greater mystery, but a glimpse into the psychological breakdown of individuals facing an unbearable ordeal. Ultimately, every theory left something unanswered. Were the writings evidence of hallucination or observation? Were they the ramblings of the mind under pressure, or a desperate attempt to warn others? Were the hikers victims of chance, of nature's cruelty, or of something hidden in the wilderness that no one wants to admit exists? Perhaps that is why the SD card continues to disturb anyone who reads it. It does not give clarity, only fragments just enough to suggest a story, but never enough to complete it. In that way, it is both a record and a riddle, leaving us trapped between reason and fear. And as with so many mysteries of the wild, it leaves us with one haunting possibility: the forest remembers what happened, even if we never will. To this day, her body has never been found. No remains, no backpack, no clear sign of where her journey ended. The only piece of her that emerged from the silence of the mountains was that single shoe and the tiny memory card hidden inside it. A fragile clue, a whisper from the past, carrying fragments of fear and resilience but stopping short of the truth. Her family still walks the trail each summer, leaving small stones on cairns, saying her name into the wind. They carry with them the weight of unanswered questions. Was it the storm that claimed her? The cold that crept too quickly? Or did someone else walk those miles with her in the shadows, unseen but never far behind? The SD card sits now in an evidence locker, duplicated and preserved, its files studied again and again. Each time, investigators return to the same haunting images: her face lit by a headlamp, her whispered words, the sound in the darkness. It is as close as anyone has come to her final moments, yet still too far to bring her home. And so, the case remains unsolved, drifting between explanation and enigma. Hikers on the Colorado Trail pass through the same valleys she once crossed, their boots pressing into the earth that may still hold her secret. Some say the wilderness keeps what it takes, that the mountains prefer silence to answers. Others believe she left behind exactly what she intended, the proof that she tried, that she fought, that her story would not vanish entirely into the trees. What lingers is not certainty, but a shadow of her presence, a mystery suspended in the thin mountain air, a lone hiker, a vanished trail, and a hidden card in a shoe. A reminder that in the vastness of the wilderness, some stories end without resolution, leaving us to wonder not only how they ended, but why. What do you think she saw out there? Comment your theory below. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and let this one live on with a simple like.